Hi, my name is Ranger Marty Smith, and we're going to go inside of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And when we go inside of Ebenezer Baptist Church, what I'm going to do, I'm going to share with you some history of what the neighborhood was like during that period of time, some history of the church, and also share with you some history of Dr. King's funeral service. So today, what I'd like to talk to you about is the Sweet Auburn Avenue community. This community that you're in right now was considered to be one of your wealthiest African-American neighborhoods in the United States. They had about 4 or 5 black millionaires come off the street. What happened was the blacks had owned their own business. In the downtown district of Atlanta, they was kicked out of that district. This was the only area they can go to start their own business. So since their backs against the walls and they had no one else to support them, they started their own insurance companies, their own banks, funeral homes, newspapers, radio stations, and pharmacies. What made this community so successful was, if you own your own insurance company and I own my own bank, you made me the chairman of the board of your insurance company, while I made you the chairman of the board of my bank, so our money could circulate inside the community. So even though America at the time was going through a Great Depression, this community was still thriving and still doing well because these people was working and supporting each other. So not only do we feel that those stories of Dr. King are very important, but we feel that it's equally important to share the stories about this community because this community had a definite impact on Dr. King's life. So we also like to share how the National Park Service came to be a part of this site. Of course, we know the King Center was here, and what happened was Miss Coretta Scott King asked the National Park Service to come to preserve the community. So Miss Coretta Scott King and President Jimmy Carter got together to make this a National Historic Site on October 10, 1980. So what the National Park Service came in and did, they preserved the neighborhood back to the way it was when Dr. King was here. So when you walk down the street, you get a chance to see what Dr. King saw as a young child. The sidewalks are put back to 1930s. They're going to eventually put the street lights back to 1930 period. They have painted the homes back to 1930 period and also left the landscape of the property to the way it was in 1930s. So you get to see what 1930s looked. And then you also get a chance to walk inside the sanctuary where Dr. King was co-pastor and see everything put back to the way it was in 1960 and 1968. So you get a chance to see the original pews that was here. You got the original pulpit furniture. You got the original tithing box, the original communion table. And also the church was painted to this Pepto-Bismol pink color that you see right now. So you can see the excellent work that your tax dollars have been responsible for us to preserve it so we can protect it, so future generations like you will have the opportunity to come and be able to enjoy it. So you're now a part of history as you see this site. This is a church where Dr. King's father and grandfather preached at for 81 years. This is also the church where Dr. King was co-pastor from the period of 1960 to 1968. He would preach 1 to 2 services every Sunday inside the sanctuary. But the church history goes back 134 years. And in a 134-year history of this church has only had 5 pastors. The founding pastor, his name was John A. Parker. He founded the church in 1886, but he left the church in 1894. And then Dr. King's grandfather, Reverend A.D. Williams, that you're going to see right up here in the window, he took over as pastor from 1894 to 1931. So in this photograph over here, you see Dr. King's father. He pastored here from 1931 to 1975. So Martin Luther King Sr. was the pastor, while Martin Luther King Jr. was a co-pastor. And Martin Luther King Jr. co-pastored here from 1960 to 1968. Now, after Dr. King's father retired in 1975, Reverend Roberts took over as pastor. And he took over as pastor from 1975 to 2005. And the current pastor, Dr. Raphael Warnock, has been here ever since 2005. So when you hear Dr. King in his speeches say things like longevity has its place, because they only had 5 pastors and a 134-year history of the church. Now, most churches, if they have 5 pastors, the history probably is about 40 years. But this church has only had 5 pastors and a 134-year history of the church. And like I shared with you, Dr. King was a co-pastor. So he co-pastored here from 1960 to 1968. He was a pastor of the church. He was a pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. But when he came here, he could not be a full-time civil rights leader and a full-time pastor, so he sacrificed being a pastor during that period of time. Mrs. King requested at the funeral service for Dr. King's sermon to be played during the funeral service. When that sermon was played, Dr. King did that sermon 2 months before his assassination. And that sermon was called The Drum Major Instinct. And you probably heard that sermon before and didn't realize that you were listening to Dr. King's closing eulogy for his funeral service. And that's the sermon when they say, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver my eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. Not to talk about how many wars that I won, but how I wanted to love and how I wanted to serve and how I wanted to help other individuals. Now we're at the final resting place for Dr. Martin Luther King and Miss Coretta Scott King. And you can see their gravesite right over this way. We're currently in front of Dr. King's childhood house. This is the house that Dr. King was born inside. Dr. King was born in his house in 1929, moved out in 1941. Dr. King's grandparents purchased his house. Reverend A.D. Williams and Miss Williams purchased his house in 1909, and they paid $3,500 for this house. What they was charged a month for mortgage was $30 a month for the next 100 months with a $500 down payment. So we're going to get a chance to go inside to see what it looked like when Dr. King grew up as a young child. Before Dr. King's mother's death, she actually came back through this house and she arranged and placed everything back into this house to the way it was when she first lived here. The piece of furniture she did not have, she looked through a 1930 Sears catalog book, then she went to the antique stores and she ordered the furniture. So as you walking through this house today, you're walking back into what it looked like when Dr. King was a child growing up in his house. When you take a look at this photograph over here, this is the family photograph of the family. If you look directly in the middle, that's Dr. King's oldest sister, Miss Christine King Ferris, who was a professor at Spelman College. Right over on this side will be Dr. King's younger brother, Alfred Daniel. They call him AD. And he died, of course, a year after Dr. King's death. Right up above from his brother is his mother. I don't know if you heard the story about his mother, but Dr. King's mother was actually shot to death down at Ebenezer Baptist Church while she was playing the organ during church service. That happened on June 30th, 1974, which was 6 years after Dr. King was assassinated. Directly in the middle is Dr. King's father. With the tan dress on is Dr. King's grandmother, Miss Williams. And right below is Dr. King when he was 10 years old. Dr. King skipped 2 grades in high school. He skipped the 9th and 12th grade, went from the 11th grade to college. So he attended college at the age of 15, graduated from college at 19 years old. Everyone on the photograph attended college. So this room that you're looking at right now is the family parlor. This is the room where the King family would entertain all their guests when guests would come over to their home. If the King family did not have guests, they would close these sliding doors and they would keep this area off limits. If you look above the piano, that's a photograph of Dr. King's grandparents. That's Reverend Williams and Miss Williams, who I shared with you earlier. That was the owners of the property who bought it in 1909. You can also see a piano inside. Dr. King and his brother had to take piano lessons. And the story goes, Dr. King and his brother really did not enjoy taking piano lessons. So what they thought they could do in order to stop taking piano lessons, they thought if they could break the piano stool, then once the instructor sit on it, the instructor would fall. The King family, Dr. King's grandparents, was choir directors down at Ebenezer Baptist Church. So at times they'll play the piano, but sometimes the choir would be in both of these rooms having choir directors. This room that you're looking into right now was originally Dr. King's grandparents' bedroom. Then after Reverend Williams' death, they changed the room over from a bedroom to a study area and a play area. You're gonna see games inside like you see a Monopoly game. Monopoly was Dr. King's favorite game. There's also a Chinese checker game inside the room, and that was his father's, Daddy King's favorite game. And right above from the fireplace, you'll see a picture of his grandfather, Reverend A.D. Williams, and directly across from the fireplace, you'll see a picture of his grandmother, Miss Jenny Williams. Also, you're gonna look inside, you'll see a radio inside the room, because back then they didn't have television, and his family would sit around the radio and listen to programs on the radio. We're in the dining room, and the King family was very strict when it came down to their dining room. If Dr. King's father was scheduled to come home for dinner at 6 o'clock, but didn't make it home to 7 o'clock, the family would not start eating dinner in his room at 7 o'clock, because the King family believed that every member of their family should be around a dining room table once dinner was being served. Now you can look at the dining room table, and you can see that one of Dr. King's favorite plates for dinner was fried chicken, black-eyed peas, collard greens, and cornbread. We're inside the kitchen now, and they said this was Dr. King's favorite place. They said he used to love sitting down, talking to his grandmother, and eating his grandmother's cooking. But they said the only thing wrong with Dr. King in this room was whenever it was his turn to wash dishes, he was never be found inside his room. They said he was always found hiding in the bathroom next door. So take a look inside of Dr. King's favorite hiding spot. You can see some of the items that they used back then. Like you can see the scrub board over here. You can also see the number 2 tub over here, and then you see the wash machine. And Dr. King's sister tells the story about this wash machine. She tells the story that when she was young, she got her arm caught and stuck inside a washing machine. And she said the only way that she got her arm out, someone had to push the white release button and unplug it. She said her arm was not broke, but it was stuck in between those rollers on the washing machine. It's very common. A lot of people come through the house, tell the stories of how they got the arm, the hand, even their hair caught inside that washing machine. This was originally Dr. King's mother's bedroom, and she passed the furniture down to her daughter, Christine. So when you look inside this room, this is probably one of the most original rooms inside the house. The only thing that we notice not original is the doll that's on Dr. King's sister's bed. And the only reason why the doll is not original, they said when Dr. King was young, Dr. King and his brother would tear his sister's doll's arms, legs, and pop the heads off her baby dolls. Right over here, you're gonna see the cellar. One of Dr. King's chores was he had to go in the backyard, shovel coal out the coal shed, and come downstairs and shovel coal into the coal furnace. Dr. King received 25 cents a week allowance. And 25 cents a week allowance was a lot of money. They said with 25 cents, Dr. King go to the movies, buy him a hamburger and a Coke with 25 cents. As you're upstairs in his house, you can see that his house is pretty big. And most people, when they come inside his house, the first thing they say is like, wow, this is a huge house. So Dr. King lived in his house with his grandparents, his parents. He had an aunt and an uncle who lived inside his house. This area that you see right here, at times when they had guests to come over, they would use this area sometime as a sleeping area. They would actually put rollaway beds out in this area, pallets, cover them over with a curtain, and let the guests sleep out in this area that we're in right now. This room served multiple purposes. This room at one time was a guest room. Also visiting ministers sometimes would stay inside this room. They rented out this room to local seminary students, but we put the room back to the way it was when Dr. King's Aunt Ida was living inside the house. So this room is the room that Dr. King was born inside. This is the room we call the birth room. This is the room where Dr. King, his brother, and his sister was born inside. And when you look inside the room, you're gonna see a clock. The clock will say 12 o'clock. That's the time that Dr. King was born inside the room. He was born on a Tuesday, January the 15th, 1929 at 12 o'clock noon. When Dr. King was born inside the room, his name was actually Michael and not Martin. When Dr. King's sister was born, I like to share this. When she was born, the family did not have a baby crib at the time, so she was placed inside the dresser drawer. They had to pull the dresser drawer out, place a sheet inside, and place his sister, Christine, inside that drawer. So this is the boys' room. This is Dr. King's and his brother's bedroom. Notice you're gonna see a baseball bat on the bed because Dr. King and his brother loved to play baseball, and they would go outside in the backyard and play baseball. So we're in the back of the King family home now. And the King family did have a garage in their backyard that looked just like the garage you see in the house next door. The only reason why the King family garage is no longer in their backyard, they said when Dr. King and his brother was young, they jumped in their dad's car, drove into the garage, and the garage collapsed and fell down. So since that garage no longer exists, we restored this garage next door so you can get an idea of what the King family garage used to look like back during that period of time. So Dr. King's community was pretty interesting and amazing in itself. So take a look at the houses on this end. Those houses are called shotgun homes. And the reason why they call them the shotgun homes, because the house went straight through. If you open up the front door of the house, you'll see directly to the back door of the house. They call it a shotgun home. They said if you ever had a shotgun and shot through the house, it would actually hit every room that was located inside the house. But your lower income kind of lived in those homes. Your textile mill workers, your maids, different things of that nature lived in those homes. But when you take a look at these homes, you're gonna see your Queen Anne Victorian style homes. So Dr. King lived in a neighborhood that was sort of economically split. You had the working class well-to-do and you had the working class poor side by side living in the community. So when you hear Dr. King speak about the beloved community, one of the reasons why he probably talked about the beloved community is because of what he saw growing up in his own neighborhood. And it was just so amazing that his house sat right in the middle of between the rich and the poor that was in his community.